Welcome back to the One Decision Away podcast. I'm your host, Elijah Mang. In this one, we're going to get into talking about the trap of healing. Now, I started my healing journey, at least intentionally, around almost 6 years ago, and it completely changed my life. It's very necessary. Now, here's the thing with healing, though, is if you look at your mind as split in two ways. And I know that you've experienced this. If it's not something that you already experience all the time, regularly, every single day, your mind is split and it's like it's constantly battling with itself internally. Like you have certain thoughts that are based on fear, and then you have certain thoughts that are based on love or trust, knowing, confidence, like love for yourself. And one may overpower the other. Now, healing can absolutely help and come into play when the negative, the fearful side, the self-criticism, all of that is overpowering the loving side and the truthful side. Now, another way I like to look at these two sides is there's the fearful side, which is it's based on nothing. It's imaginary. It's not based on reality. And so it's false. It's not true. And then the loving side is true, because the loving side is literally the nature of who you are. Like it's what you're made of. It's what you are at your core. However, the mind has these tendencies to cling to these fearful thoughts, to cling to these things that are not actually real, but they might be real. At least the mind thinks, it might be very convinced that they are real, especially when we've experienced things in our life like traumas, pains, and we've all experienced them, whether it's just like little emotional traumas or like a big catastrophic event. How most people would probably look at trauma as like a big event, but it can be the smallest things. It can be, losing your parents in the grocery store when you were 6 years old and you've got all scared and you didn't really know how to deal with or process that emotion. So that can leave a mark. That can become a part of this emotional baggage that you carry forward with you into the future. Just a little event like that. And all of those things accumulate and add up. And that's where we kind of got to this concept and idea of healing, because we need to heal all of these pains and traumas, release these trapped emotions. And while these things are absolutely valid and necessary in many ways, it can be so easy to get caught up in this trap of healing. And this is, so if we look at the split mind, the fearful side is the ego. The fearful side is the part that needs to preserve itself. And the ego has such a strong desire to preserve itself because somewhere in there it knows it's temporary. But the ego typically does not operate that way. It tries to preserve itself and act like it is the truth, like it is the objective reality of whatever we're experiencing. So when we experience all of those pains and everything and we carry them with us, our ego gets associated with all of this pain in our body. And this is what Eckhart Tolle calls the pain body. It's like this pain, or this well of pain within us that kind of has a mind of its own. It kind of just operates on its own. And when we get triggered and we like react very strongly, say with anger or something, it's not really us who's doing that. It's the pain body. It's kind of just taking things into its own hands and reacting with anger because it perceives something as a threat. It perceives some kind of threat as real. Maybe that's because the ego likes to take things personally. The ego is very sensitive. It's that part of us that always takes things personally, that will make up big stories around like a little event or a little thing that somebody did or didn't do. Maybe, they forgot to do something, and then all of a sudden we're making up stories about how, they're so inconsiderate, and then we get angry, and, we're buying into all of this stuff that's really not true about the core of who they are or who you are, but the ego and the pain body is perceiving it as a real thing, and therefore we react because it seems to be real to us. Whereas on the other side, we have the spirit, our soul, God, whatever you want to call it, that part within us that is aligned with truth, that knows what truth is, and does not see any reality in those kind of circumstances. It doesn't see any reality in anger because it knows that it's a creation of the ego. It doesn't see or perceive any reality in the pains that we experienced from the past because it knows that that's not really who we are. The spirit is so in touch with who we actually are that when we experience anything that conflicts with the truth about who we are, we feel a negative emotion. And so that's how those pains come up in the first place. And traumas come up in the first place and then stick with us. Because on one end, we know the truth deep down within us. Our spirit knows the truth of the situation, of whatever story we're telling ourselves. And it feels bad because it's literally not true. But our ego identifies with that and is like, oh yeah, you're a piece of shit. Like, you're not good enough. You're not worthy. You're not lovable. Nobody's ever going to love you. All of these different stories that the ego makes up. And so we're in this constant conflict in our mind between the ego and the spirit. And when you look at the whole concept of healing, absolutely, there are things that need to be released. There are things that need to be let go. There are old stories that we just need to unidentify with, just unlearn, just let go because they're not true. And the ego, being kind of like a parasite in a way, it clings to whatever it can so that it can survive. And it's because it's not real in eternity. It's real in this temporary world. Like, we need the ego to navigate our human experience. We need the ego to know how to operate in the world. However, the ego has no understanding of the spirit, the truth within us, the eternal nature of our being. And so it's constantly having these existential problems with itself. But that's just the nature of the ego. And so the ego, the nature of the ego being to cling to things, to identify with things, we start to identify with our body and we think we are our body. And then all of a sudden we're believing that we are something that's temporary. Or we start to identify with our thoughts and opinions. And then every time somebody says something that goes against what we believe to be true, it triggers us because it goes against our identity. Like, we believe that our mind, this ego, is who we are. And that's what the ego wants. And so when the ego clings and starts to identify with this tendency of, or practice of healing, then the ego identifies as something that is broken. That's something that needs to be fixed. That's something that needs to be healed. And maybe we look at, or we start to look at healing as this step up to getting to where we want to be in life. And we start to believe that we can't get what we want in life unless and until we heal these things. And so it becomes this never-ending cycle, because when it comes to your identity, now is the future. If you're identifying as unworthy, then you will also be that in the future, because that identity, whatever we cling to, whatever the ego clings to as this identity, is not subject to time. Like, if you're identifying with something now, then you are saying that this is what I am, this is who I am, and that becomes a belief at the core of who you think you are. But really, all these different things are not who you actually are. And so that's why, like, it's a really good practice for people really beginning to have this awareness of who you really are, to think about like all the things that you might have identified with in the past, or that you might still find yourself at least unconsciously identifying with. Like, just asking yourself the question, who are you? Or who am I? Ask yourself the question, who am I? And what comes up first is you might be like, oh, I'm an accountant. I'm a CEO. I'm whatever it might be. And you start to think about your job, but and you start to think about your job, because so often when we get into conversations with people, it's like, oh, what do you do? It's like this important part of our identity that we communicate to everybody. And it's like, if you're meeting somebody, one of the first things that you're going to learn about them is typically what they do for a living. But the ego will start to identify with this, and it might not just be your work. It could be you identify as a mom, and then, or you identify as a dad, and then you don't really see a lot in yourself outside of being a dad. Like, you don't have your own personal individual identity other than being a dad. And so that's often why, like, when kids grow up and go out of the house and go and live on their own, it can create a little bit of an existential crisis to parents who have identified as being a mom or a dad, because that's like the primary role of their identity. But really, you're so much more than that. So if you ask yourself again, okay, I'm not my job, I'm not, in my relation to anybody else, that's not who I actually am, then who are you? I'm a human. But it's like, are you your body, or are you the awareness that recognizes that you have a body? Because you are not your body, but you do have a body. So who are you? In this case, you might realize, oh, I'm the awareness that recognizes that I have a body. Or you might start to think, oh, I am blah, 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 blah. But whatever you tell yourself, it's just thoughts. You're just telling yourself, I am fill in the blank. And it's just thoughts. Whatever your answer is, it's just thoughts. It's just creations of your mind. And that's not who you actually are. When it comes down to it, you're the observer of all of this. You are the awareness that recognizes just what's happening, that you have a body, that you're thinking thoughts. You're the awareness behind the thoughts. You are not the thoughts. You are not the opinions. You are not any of this. So the ego is constantly in a battle for its own survival. But it's trying to build a house on sand. It's a weak foundation. And so when that foundation crumbles, when your identity is set in a relationship, for example, you and your partner like kind of become one, and you only see yourself through the lens of being in that relationship, and you start to identify with being that relationship. And then when that relationship fails, eventually it can create this whole existential crisis because your ego can no longer identify with that. And it's basically like an ego death in a way, a death of what the ego used to identify with. And so you may feel extremely lost at that point. You may feel like my life is over, like the world is ending. That's what it might feel like, because to the ego, it feels like death. But the tendency of the ego, it's going to grab something else. It's going to start to identify with something else after that. So maybe that relationship fails, and then all of a sudden you find yourself becoming more and more and more of a workaholic, and your ego is now identifying with your job, right? So I say all of this to say that the same can happen with healing. If you see healing as this obstacle, as this thing that you need to do to get to where you want to go, then you're constantly going to have something in between where you are now and where you want to be. Because the truth is, you don't necessarily need to do this abstract concept of healing, because when are you really healed? That's the question. When are you really healed? When does it end? Nobody can answer that. When does it end? I don't know. It doesn't. And it's like, to the ego, when it identifies with healing, it's going to constantly recreate more and more things that need to be healed. And so it's this never-ending cycle. And now you're completely operating from a place of incompleteness, of separation, because you are believing the separation within your own mind between ego and spirit. You're perceiving that separation, and everything that you do in your life is pretty much based on this idea of separation. It's, I am depressed, I need to do this, and this to be happy. But really, the depressed part is all of that stuff that you've accumulated, including the stories and the emotions that are kind of tied to those stories. That becomes the pain body. The ego starts to identify with that, and then all of a sudden, you are this broken person. Like, you might start to identify as this broken person after the relationship that you thought was everything. You thought this person was your other half that completed you. The relationship ends, and then you you're only a half because you no longer have that person who supposedly completes you, right? So you're only a half. So where do you go from there? You're broken. You need to heal, right? But the ego will identify with it. And so this is the trap of healing. So the truth is that when you experienced those things that caused the pain in the past, when you experienced the childhood trauma, when you experienced the breakup, the divorce, the loss of your job, whatever, maybe life just went completely downhill and just you hit rock bottom during COVID. Maybe you lost your job or whatever, just you lost a family member or a loved one, and it felt like everything was just crumbling. What you may have experienced at that point and believed to be true was that things now need to be fixed for you to feel how you want to feel, for you to have the life that you want to live. Instead of recognizing that you already are complete, recognizing that you already are healed, and the real thing that needs to be healed is this idea of perceiving yourself as somebody that is in lack, that is incomplete, that is separate, that needs to be healed, that's broken, however you're perceiving yourself. So it's not that something from the past that happened that hurt you needs to be corrected. It doesn't need to be corrected because it never had any true foundation it never had any real foundation based on truth to begin with. It was only a perception. It was never actually true. But you've just carried that perception with you and maybe identified with it. Maybe just brought that in and added it to the pain body and the identity, the attachments of whatever the ego is trying to cling to for its own survival, to make you believe that it is real, that it is you. It's not really you. And so honestly, what inspired this episode was I was talking to a client and they were speaking to me in a way where it's like they were creating a healing to-do list, like a list of things that they need to go back to, journal on, heal from, and address. And it's like all of this stuff is just accumulated. And then there's also this feeling of guilt after that, because it's like, oh, I still have to go and address these things and heal from these things. And two things here. One, you're not looking at the truth of reality. You're buying into a false story of something that needs to be corrected, when the only thing that needs to be corrected is how you're seeing that thing. Two is you're building up this to-do list as if these are just things that you need to check off in order to actually start experiencing the life that you want to experience. When in reality, in order to actually start experiencing the life that you want to experience, you need to correct that perception now. You just need to see yourself, the wholeness within yourself now. And not just see it, not just like try to perceive it, but come into a space of internal knowing of that wholeness within yourself. And sometimes you have to shut out all the thoughts. You have to shut out this incessant thinking of the ego that's really neurotic thinking, because the ego is neurotic, and you just need to shut it out. And this is the biggest, this seems to be the biggest challenge for people, is turning off the mind, turning it off, like turning off all these thoughts. And so that's why it's so beneficial to develop a practice of meditation and mindfulness, just getting deep into a relaxed state where you're just observing, and you can start to disconnect the idea of you and who you are from your thinking. Because when you recognize and truly see and know that you are not your thinking, you'll really start to see and know the eternal nature of your spirit, of your being, of and when you get to that point, it's like you're basically just like stepping into this place where you recognize you're already healed and there's nothing else to do. And so it's not like you don't need to cultivate this practice of meditation to heal. No, you don't need to do anything to heal. You just need to step into the place where you already are healed and operate from that place. See the world from that place. And you're not seeing the world from that place if you're attacking other people, or if you are defending yourself. Like if other people are in disagreement with something that if other people are in disagreement with an opinion of yours and you feel defensive, that's because you're identifying with the opinion. So just letting go and stepping back into the place of wholeness where you are not your opinion, that you don't have anything to defend. You don't need to be defensive because there's nothing that can be attacked. There's nothing that can be hurt. There's nothing that can be broken down because you are whole. And you can't possibly be anything other than whole except for a perception of yourself as not whole. So that's the trap of healing. Like, you don't need to heal so that you can then start to live your life and be present and whatever. You just need to be present and recognize that you're already whole and there's nothing to heal or fix other than stories. And that's all it is. So it can be quite confusing and it can also seem to contradict itself. But that's the funny thing, is there are a lot of paradoxes like this that seem to contradict itself, but both sides are actually very true. And so embrace the contradiction, embrace the idea that you can still do these healing practices like meditation, like visualization, like releasing stuff from the past, releasing energy in your body from the past. You can still do those things without identifying as somebody who needs to be healed. And so those things will still help you as long as you are not identifying as somebody that needs to be healed, because ultimately it comes down to identity. When it comes to identity, now is the future. So whatever identity you want to experience yourself as in the future, step into that now. If you're healing and you want to be healed in a sense, like maybe you see it as a means to getting what you really want to get in your life is healing, you need to do that first. See yourself as already healed. See yourself as already the person who has everything that you want to create in your life, who is living the life that you want to live. And step into that feeling state. And use these practices not to heal or correct anything, because there's nothing to correct, but to just step into that state of awareness, of being what you want to be. This is the secret of creation. This is the secret of who you are. This is one of the biggest secrets of life, and it's not a secret. It's just, it can be very confusing and back and forth and all over the place when you get caught up in these stories of the ego as truth or as reality. Really, it's a false truth built on a false foundation, a weak foundation. And when it really comes down to it, it cannot stand up against the truth. And so that's why when you get into those states of deep meditation and you really connect with that part within yourself that knows the truth, none of those stories are there anymore. They're not present. The mind becomes quiet and you feel just this sense of satisfaction, of joy, of life within you, of energy within you, of love, of truth, because that's all there is. You've just drowned out the voice that was telling you everything else. You've just returned to the whole center that is within you, that has always been within you. And that's all there is to it. So drop a comment. Let me know your thoughts on this. I hope this is beneficial to you. Share if it was. Like, comment, subscribe. Very much appreciated. And remember, you're only one decision away. You can decide to be whole in this moment. You can decide to no longer buy into all these stories of the ego. And it's going to be a process, most likely. But when you make that decision, you're committed to a certain ending. When you commit to a certain result or ending, it will create itself. It will come about because you've committed to it. And when you commit to the recognition of being whole right now, that's when your life will start to change. That's when you will start to feel more peaceful, more calm, more at ease, because there's nothing that needs to be fixed. There's nothing that needs to be corrected, because anything that seems to need a correction is not real to begin with. It is a weak foundation because it's a creation of the ego. So I hope you enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts. Again, I appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.